Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of December. And this past month, I was able to read 33 books. Now, this was in part because I had time off of work for the holidays. And whenever I have time off of work, I tend to read more. And I can tell you right now, I may not remember all of the details and all of the plot points of all 33 of these books, but I'm going to do the best I can, especially from those ones that are from early in the month. So I started the month by reading a book called Going Zero by Anthony McCarten. And this is a book that I had heard really good things about, that it was a good thriller. And it's basically about like a futuristic setting where the government is kind of testing out a new program where people are going to go off grid and then the government is going to try to find them. And so you can kind of sign up for this program and then you get kind of like, I think it's like a day's notice or something like that. So you know you're going to do it and you have months to plan how you're going to like hide basically from the government. And then you get like a day's notice and then you have to just do it, like run away and do the program. And I thought this was actually really interesting, like to learn a little bit more about surveillance technology and the possibilities of future surveillance technology. So I really enjoyed this one, would highly recommend it. Then I picked up Ali Hazelwood's most recent book, Check and Mate, which is a young adult romance that is based in the world of chess. Now, I also really enjoyed this book as well. I've enjoyed Ali Hazelwood's books. She often does STEM-focused romances and often set in academia. And this was the first one of hers that I've read that was young adult. And I think this may be her only young adult at this point as well. So would highly recommend that one also. I also was able to get through all of the remaining Kay Scarpetta novels by Patricia Cornwell, and there were 27 of them that I read throughout the year, and I got through 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27 in the month of December. So I will just read the titles of these. The main thing to know is that the series, because it is so long, has such interesting kind of character development, has such interesting twists and turns that are pretty major in terms of like characters dying off, characters turning into criminals, characters changing jobs, locations, people move around a lot. Like there's a lot of things happening within this particular book series. And so I won't go into the plots of each of these books, but the 23rd book in the series is called Depraved Heart. And then the 24th book in the series is called Chaos. The 25th book is called Autopsy. And scrolling here to see where's book 26 in my list. 26 is called Livid. And then the most recent book, which actually I think came out just this year, is Unnatural Death. That is number 27. So what a fun ride to read like an entire large lengthy series in the course of a year. I'm really glad I did it. And I'm really glad it's done. I also picked up the second book in the Honeywood Romance Quartet. I believe there are 4 books in this series. It's called The Fiction Between Us by Julie Olivia. This is the series of romances that are set in a theme park. And this one is basically a enemies to lovers trope where 2 main characters had kind of known each other in high school and had always been kind of enemies. And then they get thrown together in kind of like a fake dating situation, and then of course develop a relationship. So I like this one enough that I'm going to continue with the series and see where it goes with the other characters. I also wanted to pick up some holiday themed books in the month of December. And so one that I picked up is called Baggage Claim by Juliana Smith. And this is basically about 2 people who are on a plane together. And the woman character says that she's kind of told her family that she has a fake boyfriend, and the guy next to her on the plane is like, I'll be your fake boyfriend. And so he ends up kind of barely knowing this person, but coming and like infiltrating her family over the course of the holidays. I thought this was very cute. I liked it. And I think holiday themed romances are always just kind of fun. And this one was no different. All right, then I picked up a book called The Obsession by Nora Roberts, and I'm going to remind myself of the plot because I've read several Nora Roberts lately, and sometimes they run together. So this one, I actually really thought the premise was interesting. So it's basically the story of a woman who, when she is a young girl, she follows her father into the woods and basically discovers that he has been keeping this woman in a cellar, like buried under the ground. And she is part of who like catches the father with being like a serial killer, basically. And then as she grows up and is becoming an adult, she has separated herself out from this, like no longer has contact with her father, and then is in a situation in her adult life where there are killings that are happening that are similar to what her father did. And so she's becoming kind of embroiled in this situation. I feel like Nora Roberts has a really broad range of what she's writing. Some of it is fantasy, some of it is mystery and thriller, some of it is romance, some of it is courtroom. Like, she does so many different things, and she just has dozens and dozens and dozens of books out there, that I feel like this book was solid, but I also can imagine that some of her plots and characters kind of run together just because there's sometimes similar tropes that she's working with, and she just has such a volume of books. But I'm still enjoying diving into her backlist, and I will continue to do so. All right, then I picked up a book called In a Holidays by Christina Lauren. And I think this might have been one of the first books I read by this author, which I believe is two women writing together under this author's name. And basically, this is the story of a woman who is living with her parents, and they're going to this Utah cabin where she's been multiple times with her family, and she has this kind of crush on a family friend that they typically go to this cabin together. And there's like this Groundhog's Day trope that's happening within this story. Now, I will acknowledge Groundhog's Day tropes are not my favorite. I find them kind of interesting, but I also feel like they can get kind of old very quickly. And I feel like this book was fine, but it's definitely not a favorite of mine, and probably one that I would not revisit in the future. But I'm glad I read it, and it kind of checked the box in terms of kind of just like a light holiday story. Okay, the next book that I picked up is one that I had actually started reading a while back, but it was just very long, and it's called Forever and Ever by Lucy Score. I've been slowly working my way through Lucy Score's backlist. She writes romance stories that often have these like wonderful side characters, and they're often long. Some of her novels are like 500 to 600 pages, and this one was a little under 600 pages, so it took me a while to get through it. One of the things that I found really interesting about this particular story was it takes place on this island, and it's very kind of like remote in that, like, during the winter time, people can't get on and off this island very easily. And this woman basically comes home. Her family lives on this island. Her mother is the sheriff of this island. And then they have this kind of family friend who's a love interest for her, who works for her mother. He's like a deputy or a police officer on the force on this island. And basically there's kind of this like history of them having this relationship when they were teenagers. And then she ended up moving off island. He stayed on the island, and now they're kind of coming back together. And really there's a lot of like miscommunication trope in this as well, of like why they did not, realize that they both had feelings for each other and all these different kinds of things. This book, I think, probably has a couple of trigger warnings for people. There's domestic violence. There's some other things that are happening that I would encourage you to read about it a little bit, just to make sure it's a right fit for you. The thing that I liked about it the most was there was a combination of kind of suspense and a little bit of like thriller and mystery with the romance element. And that's a subgenre of romance that's probably my favorite, when you have something like a mystery that's getting solved. The next book I picked up is called One Day in December by Josie Silver. And this is a story about basically two people that see each other. One's on a bus, one's on the street, their eyes meet, they have this like moment of connection, and then they continually run into each other over the next like 10 years of their lives in various settings, but they can't be together for a number of reasons, which become clear very early in the book. This is a little bit of like a Groundhog's Day, like in that they're continually running into each other, but they're maturing over time. They're in different relationships with different people. You're learning more about the characters. I actually found this plot to be very kind of intricate and interesting in terms of how the author was like bringing these people back together. I could see revisiting this book in the future and would definitely recommend it. Okay, the next book I picked up was another Nora Roberts, and this is why I'm getting them confused, this is a book about a woman who it starts to engage with this man, like she's kind of dating him, and he ends up being a con man. And early on in the book, this is not a spoiler, he breaks into her house and kills her roommate. And the FBI thinks that he was actually trying to kill her. And so she then goes on, kind of lives her life. And this is a person who's like still trying to kind of like steal her identity and like interact with her in all these negative ways. And so it's a kind of like a little bit of romance suspense, but I feel like more on the suspense thriller side than the romance side as she's kind of moving through her life. Again, another kind of solid backlist from Nora Roberts, and I enjoyed that one too. All right, then I picked up a book called Home at Night. This is the 5th book in the Mercy and Elvis mysteries by Paula Munier. And the kind of basic premise of the set of mysteries is Mercy is a retired veteran, and the dog was the dog of her partner who was killed in combat. And she and the dog are like kind of amateur solving mysteries. She's in a relationship with the town sheriff. And in this particular book, I was a little bit nervous because it starts out as kind of a Halloween-y, like ghost story kind of book. And because that's around the time it came out, this past year was October. And I thought, I'm not really in like a Halloween-y mood. But actually, I really liked there was like this historical element of this house that was kind of this house that had been rumored to have ghosts, and a body is found in this house, and kind of the story goes on from there. But there was this really fun historical element to the story that I really enjoyed. I felt like it kind of brought in like a little bit of like a historical mystery in addition to the contemporary that you're getting with these characters. And I just really enjoy this series. I think it's great. This is another solid entry to this series. And you see kind of the relationships of the different characters developing over time too, which I also enjoy. Okay, the next book I picked up is 100 Names by Cecilia Ahern. This was one of my Alphabet Challenge books for the month. And this is basically a book that has a great premise. I'm not sure it delivered on the premise, but the premise is there is a woman who's gone through kind of this embarrassing professional situation. She's a journalist, and her mentor hands her this list of 100 names and says, like, you should do this as your next story. Then the mentor dies. She doesn't know what these 100 names are, and she has to go like track down these people and figure out what's going on. I feel like with this particular book, there was just a lot happening. Like there were a lot of side characters because of the names on the list. There was a lot going on with the main character trying to figure out what was happening. And it all comes together in the end. And I think it comes together pretty well. But there were parts in the middle where I found myself getting, I don't know, like a little bit bored with like what was happening in the story. And the other book that I've read by this author, I think it's the same author, is P.S. I Love You, which was made into a film, which I loved that particular book. And I should check that this is the same author that I'm thinking of. Let me look up her books really quickly. Yes, that is the same author. And she's got a bunch of other ones as well, a couple of which I've read, but I loved P.S. I Love You. I thought it was so great. And I don't feel like this book lived up to as much of what I liked about that other book. Okay, then I picked up a book called Once Upon a December by Amy Reichert. And this book was kind of odd. It's basically about these two people who have feelings for each other, man and a woman. The man works at this like Christmas bazaar or like Christmas like shops basically that only show up at a certain point every year. They're like magical basically. And the woman keeps coming in, but then she like forgets that she's met him. And there's this whole situation of like him having to be in this like alternative universe where he's time traveling to like get to this place where the shops are showing up every year. I will admit that like I was a little distracted by just like the science of like what was going on and feeling like this is a very bizarre premise to this particular book. I liked where it ended up. I thought it was kind of sweet, but definitely not kind of the typical thing that I would read. And I feel like it fell a little bit toward like the fairy tale category, which is not a genre that I typically enjoy reading. So again, this was an Alphabet Challenge book. So I'm glad that I picked it up for the holidays, and it was interesting. Okay, the next book I read is Unsolved. This is the second book in the Invisible series by James Patterson and David Ellis. And this is basically about an FBI agent who solves cases when the cases have like really, it doesn't seem like the cases would be connected, but she sees some kind of connection and finds a way to find clues that kind of connect the cases together. And this particular book is very similar in some ways to the first one because that's what she does. So it's kind of setting up her character in a deeper way. There's a couple of relationships in this book that don't super make sense to me. And I think that part of it, maybe I missed something in the first book about kind of like what's going on with a couple of these characters. But I feel like I'm still kind of getting my feet under me with this series. But I generally enjoyed it. I feel like it's a little bit, I don't know, like the premise is really interesting, but the writing is a little bit vague. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it. It probably doesn't make much sense, but it feels very kind of high level in terms of like, you don't get super invested in any of the characters. And there feels like there's a little bit of distance from the characters, which I guess in like a thriller makes sense. But when I get into kind of like mystery series, I want to feel like connected to the characters and like rooting for them. And I'm not quite feeling that for these characters yet. However, the plots are really interesting and I would keep reading just to kind of see where this goes. Okay, then I picked up the next book in my Alphabet Challenge, which is called The Organized Mind, Thinking Straight in the Age of Information Overload by Danielle Levitin. What I would say about this book is it's lengthy. I think it's about 500 pages. I listened to it on audio. It reads a little bit like a textbook. And so I feel like if you are not interested in this topic in a deep way, this is probably not a book to pick up. There are some kind of interesting examples and stories that get told throughout this book. And I would put myself in a category of someone who's not necessarily interested in this in a deep way. Like in a surface level way, you know, I'm interested and I want to know more about kind of like how our brains deal with information overload. And I've certainly read about neuroscience and various other things, but I do think that this is a book that's more of a specialist book. And the reviews I read kind of agreed with that if this is like something where you want to get deep knowledge, it reads a little bit like a textbook. Okay, the next book I picked up is one called Lovelight Farms by B.K. Borison. And this is basically the story of two best friends who fake date as part of this like competition that's happening. And the woman owns this tree farm. And then her best friend comes along to kind of like fake date her because they're being featured on like a social media account. And the tree farm is struggling. And so the woman is kind of doing this competition to try to get back to a place where they are more like financially solvent with this tree farm. I will say I was kind of surprised by this book because I've seen so many people just love it. Like it is just beloved. And so many people enjoy this entire series. There's, I think, 3 books in the series right now. I will read book 2 just because I'm kind of curious to see. I think that just picks up a couple other characters that are in book 1 and they have a romance. But I feel like I wasn't getting the vibe of like why everyone is just absolutely head over heels in love with this book. So I'll probably do a deeper dive on some of the reviews just to kind of see what people are thinking. I thought it was good. I thought it was a nice kind of like Christmas themed book, but I feel like Christmas themed romances definitely fall into a separate category for me in terms of not necessarily having kind of the depth of some of the other kinds of romances that I tend to enjoy. So it was good. And I think if you want a Christmas themed romance, I would put this at the higher level of some of the other ones that I read this month. The next book that I picked up is called The Career Arts. This is by Ben Weldofsky, and the subtitle is Making the Most of College Credentials and Connections. This is a book that I definitely picked up for work. This is very tied to the kinds of things that I work on in my job. I work in higher ed, and I do a lot of work around like program development and helping different folks around the institution think about what are the right programs to like launch and how we want to be working with things like micro-credentials. I mean, I could go on and on, but like this is a workbook. All that to say, this is a workbook. I actually really enjoyed this book. It's relatively short. I felt like this author gave a very clear overview of the kinds of things that we're all talking about right now around this space. So if you're interested in kind of understanding credentialing and how it's like shifting right now within higher education, I would definitely pick this up. I think it's absolutely worth a read. I was able to read it very quickly. There was a lot in it that for me was a review. Like there was not a lot of new information in this book just because I'm in this space and I'm reading a lot of things in this space. But if you're new to this space and you're trying to kind of learn a little bit more about credentialing and kind of shifting evolution of that in the higher ed space, I would definitely pick it up. The next book I picked up is called Love Redesigned by Lauren Asher. This is the first book in the Lakefront Billionaires series, but it is tied to another series that she wrote also about billionaire romances. that some of the characters also were tied to this kind of like lakefront space. And so one of them actually like does a cameo in this book. So there's ties to this earlier series. I will just say, I'm not sure billionaire subgenre romances are for me. Like while I have enjoyed some of the things I've read by this author in particular, it's not enough that I would like go seek out other billionaire romances. And I think that they just have, and again, I don't know because I've only really read them from this author. They have a vibe that maybe it's this author, maybe it's the subgenre, I don't know. But it's just kind of strange that you have people with obscene amounts of money that can solve problems like at the drop of a hat because they have obscene amounts of money. Like they can travel places and they can buy things for people. And it just is kind of odd and very different, obviously, than the life that most of us are living. So I felt like this book was solid in terms of kind of the relationship and what was being built, but it's also just in a subgenre that I don't think is really for me. All right, the next book I picked up is called The Predictable Heartbreaks of Imogen Finch by Jacqueline Firkins. And this is a book that I thought was very charming. The premise of this is you have a woman who is always in relationships where she gets left for someone else. Like she's always the second choice in these relationships. And this has happened to her like 17 times. And she has this old friend like from high school who comes back into town and they begin a relationship and she's kind of concerned about, you know, like, is she going to be second best to him as well? And part of the reason she has this like second best thing is it's a curse that basically like her mother is kind of psychic and her mother gave like this, I don't know, like she kind of just said, this is how your life is going to be. And therefore like, this is how it's been. Like she had this like proclamation. And so part of this is like breaking this curse that her mother kind of put on her. And I don't know, curse is the wrong word because her mother did not do it in any kind of mean fashion, but she just kind of like made this statement and it's come true. And so there's a lot of concern on behalf of the female main character that like, this is what her life is going to be like. I thought that, again, the side characters for this were very charming. The small town that they were in was very charming. If you're looking for something, I put this as in my mind, it's kind of like a fall read, but I think it could make a good summer read as well. Okay, next up, I picked up a book called Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. This is a fourth book, I think, in her STEM-themed romance novels. And basically, you have a woman who is an adjunct professor, and because she cannot make any money as an adjunct professor, she is doing this like fake dating app where it is only fake dating. It is not any form of like sexual services, but like she just kind of pretends to be people's girlfriend. And basically what happens is she goes for a job interview for a tenure track position, the holy grail of what everybody's trying to do in academia. And the brother of this guy that she's been fake dating is on the committee, and he's like very confused because he knows her as like a totally different person with a different job. When you fake date, you are obviously not telling the truth about who you are, and so it causes all of this confusion. Great premise to kind of like start out this book. And anyone who's situated within academia, there's a lot here to enjoy in terms of just like the tropes and the stereotypes and other kinds of things that are happening in this particular book. And I liked where it kind of ended up as well. I think that Ali Hazelwood continues to be kind of a favorite romance author for me. Okay, then I fell into reading a book that was like not on my radar, but I got it from the library. It's called The Way I Used to Be. It is the first book in I think a duology. And it's by Amber Smith. I loved this book. It was so good, and I just completely was sucked into it. The plot of it is a little bit challenging, so definite trigger warnings. But basically the story of this book is there is a girl who is a freshman in high school, and when she is a freshman in high school, she is sexually assaulted, and she doesn't tell anyone. And so the book covers her freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year of high school, and basically how she is coping with the situation. This is very similar to other books in this space. There's one I'm trying to think of the title of, and I'm not gonna be able to think of the title of, but man, let me see if it is tied to this book in any way. Other people would describe it as like a version of this other book. I will look up this other book and I will put a copy of the one that I'm thinking of, the picture, so you can see what I'm talking about. But there is basically another book about a girl who was sexually assaulted when she was in high school and how she is kind of dealing with the trauma of that. So you could definitely compare this book to the other one that I'm thinking of. I don't know what it was about this book that I was just completely sucked into this story. I wanted to know what happened to this girl. I was completely invested in her. I was invested in the friendships that she was like creating, and also the friendships that she was just like completely blowing up because she was dealing with all of this trauma. And of course, there's a second book in this series, and I immediately picked it up. I mean, I was like super interested in where this was going. And so I really, really enjoyed this one. And I feel like this came completely out of left field. Like I just was not expecting this author. I've not read anything by her before. So that's one that I would highly recommend, but definitely check the trigger warnings first. The next book I picked up was Sable Peak. This is the 6th book in the Eden series by Devney Perry. And this is a series that kind of plays with genre a little bit, definitely romance. In the early books, the first book in particular, it was kind of this mystery thriller. And then there's all these different romance tropes that kind of come up throughout the series. In this particular book, this is the final book in the series. It is the final sibling that is kind of getting his own romance. And the last book, book 5, there was a character who comes into the family because of what happens in book 5. I don't want to give too much away because it's a spoiler of like what's going on. But there's a character who kind of joins this family, and there's a period of years. So there's like a number of years that go by with this person joining the family, and then this brother, who he finds out, I feel like I'm telling this in a very disjointed way, but he finds out that he has a child, an infant child, and the mother of that child dies. I don't think this is a spoiler. This is like part of the plot. And he goes and gets the child and brings the child back. The person who has joined their family and this brother go for like multiple years, because this child is like 2 to 3 years old before they start to kind of engage in their romance. And it is a very sweet story about kind of how they both kind of wake up to this idea of like having a relationship with each other, and how they're supporting each other in various ways through different challenges that they're experiencing in their lives. Trying not to give away too many spoilers here. I really liked how this closed out the series. There was also this really fun kind of epilogue at the end of the book that ages everybody into the future, and you get to kind of see what's going on, and that was really fun too. Okay, the next book that I picked up is called Ruthless Vows. This is the 2nd book in the Letters of Enchantment duology by Rebecca Ross. The first book was called Divine Rivals. Divine Rivals I read in a day. I loved it. It's about like these 2 people who are rival journalists, and they are like communicating to each other through these magical typewriters. Don't ask me why it worked, but it totally worked. And I just love the story. I love the vibe of the story. It had a very kind of like World War I feel to it, even though it was set in kind of a magical world. I was really looking forward to the 2nd book. And maybe my expectations were just like way too high. This came out the day after Christmas. So I like immediately picked it up. I got it on audio. You know, I immediately dove into it. I feel like I may need to revisit it again. And this is how I always feel when I read a book and it's like not hitting for me. The first question I ask myself is like, is it me? Is the reason it didn't hit like I didn't read it at the right time, or I wasn't paying attention, or whatever, like I wasn't in the right frame of mind? Because I feel like this should have been a book that I really, really enjoyed. But it got, I don't know, like more political. It was more about like there's these gods that are warring with each other, and it got more about the gods, and it was less, I felt like, about the relationship. And the first book felt more romancy than fantasy, and the 2nd book felt more fantasy than romance, which I think is fine. The same thing happened in the Fourth Wing series. The 2nd book was way more fantasy, but that's a 5-book arc. And so I was like ready to go there. But with a 2-book arc, I was kind of just like, I don't know, like I felt like this fell a little flat for me. So I'm gonna like reserve judgment and maybe go back and like read these again. The other thing that I did not do was I did not read Divine Rivals, like reread it before I went into Ruthless Vows. And I considered doing that, and then I just felt like I didn't have the time. So if I was to read this again, I would read them back to back and just kind of see, you know, like how I'm feeling about them. I also want to read some more reviews, because not a lot of people have read this yet. So I'm kind of curious if other people are feeling the same way that I'm feeling, or if they're just, I've like completely missed the mark in terms of what I was supposed to get out of this book. Okay, the next book I read is called The Switch by Beth O'Leary. I've read several things by Beth O'Leary. I have liked many of them. I also enjoyed this book. This is a romance in a couple of ways, because there is a woman and her grandmother, and they decide to switch apartments, hence the title, The Switch. And the grandmother moves to London because she's looking for a little romance, and the granddaughter moves to this kind of like small village because she's basically burnt out from work. And so she's trying to kind of, she's in a relationship, but she's burnt out from work and she's trying to kind of like recover. And hijinks ensue. I loved the grandmother character. She was the best part of the book for me. The kinds of things that she was doing in London were great. The relationships that she built while she was there. The small town stuff was also fine, but I feel like the grandmother character really shone in this book, and it was just kind of charming and funny. And I liked those chapters the best when we were hearing kind of that voice of the grandmother. I did listen to it on audio and really enjoyed it. Okay, then I randomly picked up the Holiday Brothers series by Devney Perry. These are basically 3 novellas that have been put into a novel, but these were available on Audible Premium. Like, they were just kind of this free thing, and I didn't know that they were there. And I think I like followed Devney Perry on social media, and she mentioned this, and I was like, oh, I should go read these like novellas. They're all like 3 to 4 hours long on audio, so I would guess they're maybe 100, 150 pages novellas. And they just tell kind of these interconnected stories of 3 brothers who are having different romance situations. The first one is about a man who is a single father, and the nanny is who he has a romance with. I'm not gonna be able to even remember all of these. There was one about 2 people who work together where they're kind of having this fake dating, not fake dating, but secret dating situation. And then there's another, the third one is a brother who finds out that somebody that he was in a relationship with is pregnant after they have finished their relationship. And so they're kind of dealing with that situation. I thought these were fun. I mean, they're kind of just like little holiday novellas that got collected into a book. And again, like on the meter of like holiday romances, I thought they were okay. Okay, 4 books left before we wrap up December. The next book I read is a book called Rooftoppers by Katherine Rundell. This is a YA kind of magical fantasy book that I saw somebody recommend it, like, and I had never heard of it, and I thought it just looked kind of interesting. This reminds me a little bit of just kind of like, there's like an orphan girl. She's looking for her mother. She meets these other young people who are kind of like called rooftoppers. They are orphans who quote unquote live in the sky, and I just found this to be very charming. It's quite short. I mean, it's under 300 pages, and I could see like reading this to a child. Like, I mean, it definitely has kind of these fun magical elements that I would put it as like a fall read, just kind of with the vibes. So that was kind of a random thing that I picked up this past month. I also read Rachel Lynn Solomon's Business or Pleasure. And I continue to love Rachel Lynn Solomon. I think she just does a phenomenal job of repping various forms of mental health issues and mental illness. She often talks about things like anxiety and depression, and does a wonderful job of helping to show how relationships kind of work through these issues when you have somebody in the relationship who's dealing with that thing. In this particular book, I thought the premise was great. It's basically a man and a woman who have like a one-night stand, and the man thinks it's great and the woman is like, that was awful. And then they run into each other in a professional capacity, and they have to start working together. And so they basically make this deal where she will help him to become better at sex, and she's like walking him through how to do this. It's very cute, it's very sweet, and I feel like there were elements of this that were, one of the things I guess that Rachel Lynn Solomon does well is like real adults having real relationships. And this really felt like that to me, of like 2 people who are grown up, like they're adults, they're in their professional lives, and they're still trying to kind of like find love and romance. And I just think she does a great job with that. Okay, then I picked up the very lengthy 4th addition to the Blood and Ash series called The War of Two Queens by Jennifer Armentrout. This is a 5-book series. I have talked about this, I think, in several other videos. It's basically a vampire-esque series. That's how it's kind of marketed. But it is so much more than that. And it has all these crazy twists and turns. It is so hard to describe what is actually going on in this book. and in the series, because every single book has like these random unveilings of things that you're like, okay, what is going on? And I was trying to describe this to my partner the other night, and I feel like what's very telling is the main female character. She will learn something about like what's going on in the magic system of this book, and she'll kind of look around and be like, well, I hope somebody else understands that because I don't. I mean, like, it's very hard to follow in some ways what's going on, and yet you're also just completely sucked in. And so I feel like this would make a great book where you could talk with other people about it. I don't really feel like it's a book club book, but I would definitely want to talk with other people to be like, are you understanding what's going on here? Because despite the fact that I'm not fully understanding what's going on, I'm like sucked into the plot, sucked into the characters, trying to follow what's going on. And now I only have one book left in this series. So I will continue to read this and see what eventually happens. This definitely does feel like a series that I could read again, just because there's a lot of layers that I don't fully understand. But did get through the fourth book, which I think, let me look at the pages here. It's like over 600 pages. So it was a lengthy audiobook for me to work through. All right, the last book that I read in the month of December is a quick little one called The Laws of Lifetime Growth, subtitle, Always Make Your Future Bigger Than Your Past. This is a book by Dan Sullivan and Catherine Nomura. I have read a lot of Dan Sullivan's books. He often co-writes with other people. And this is somebody who is a coach, like he runs a coaching company. And I have enjoyed several of his other books. I find them to be really interesting. He often boils down principles into like very relatable kind of sets of ideas that people can apply to their own lives. And this book is a really nice example of that. Basically, what he talks about is this concept of thinking about how your future should always be, quote unquote, bigger than your past. And he terms that growth, but it doesn't necessarily mean like bigger and better. Like it's more about like, how are you kind of evolving over time? At least that's how I was kind of reading it. And there were a lot of things that I highlighted in this book. And that is not always true of the nonfiction books that I read. But I really, really enjoyed the principles and kind of what he was talking about. And I found a lot of things that just, it gave me pause. Like it gave me like a moment to kind of reflect and think and ask a question about kind of like my own professional and personal journey. I would definitely read this book again. I would definitely add this book to kind of my personal library because I think it could be helpful for me to kind of dip in and out of it at future points as well. Okay, so those are the 33 books that I read in the month of December, and what a fun set of books it was. I, of course, will be posting my January TBR video soon. I have some very fun reading goals coming up in the year 2024 that I'm excited to share. And if you want to drop in the comments below, you can definitely tell me what you were reading in the month of December and anything you want me to be adding to my TBR piles in the months ahead. Until the next video, happy reading.